once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Professor Eli Zaretsky, Professor of History at New School for Social Research. His previous books include Secrets of the Soul, A Social and Cultural History of Psychoanalysis, and Capitalism, The Family and Personal Life. The book we're going to talk about today is Why America Needs a Left, a Historical Argument. Dr. Zaretsky, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's good to have you on, and this presents a very interesting assessment of how the political left has provided a social consciousness to liberal ideas. Is that a fair statement?
That is.
Mm-hmm.
Except I would, rather than say the political left, I would say a political left, because my book is called Why America Needs a Left rather than the left. I'm not so much defending the people who call themselves the left today, but I'm defending the idea of a left and the history of a left that we've had.
Yes, actually, I guess it's more accurate to say that you're talking about three lefts in the face of three great crises, and
right.
The seedbed starts with the first major left movement, although it didn't earn the name left right away, and that's abolitionism.
Right. So one of the basic ideas I have in the book is that the word left, the term left, comes from Europe, because in Europe you have the parliaments are set up by left, center, right. We have a Democratic Party and Republican Party. We have a two-party system. So you don't necessarily get the term left, but the abolitionists, I argue, were the first American left. They invented all of the repertoire of the American left, meaning agitation, meaning refusal to compromise on a basic moral issue, forcing people to see the stakes of the issue, pamphleting, going door to door, first people to bring blacks into public, bring women into public.
They also were big on nonviolent approaches, and that's something that they should get credit for. And
Yes, they were. I mean, there was, of course, the John Brown raid and the Civil War, but they also they thought a lot about nonviolence. Nonviolence is extremely important to the history of the American left. Martin Luther King, obviously. And it's based on understanding how much the system itself is actually based on violence.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's an important distinction you make between the American Revolution and other revolutions that were going on in the 18th century. Right.
So we often think of the American Revolution as itself revolutionary and itself the creation of our democratic heritage, and there is some reason to do so. So the American Revolution does have a very strong idea of freedom. It does have an idea of rights. It has a very important idea of national independence. But in spite of the Declaration of Independence, what it doesn't really have is a strong idea of equality. And the other revolutionary heritage, when we think about the French Revolution and so forth, includes a much stronger idea of equality. And the argument I make in the book is that it was the left that brings the idea of equality into American society. You can believe in freedom and not believe in equality. No one believed in freedom more than the slaveholders. And they believed in the freedom to hold on to their slaves, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But equality is the idea of equal freedom, that we can't just oppress others and call ourselves free.
Mm-hmm. Now, part of this history of abolitionists makes it clear that America was one of the last to end slavery. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire was in 1833, for instance.
Right.
And so other countries abolished slavery on a different basis than the United States did, right?
Right. I mean, we are really a slave society. We have to make a distinction between places like, let's say Britain, for example, was not a slave society. It had slave colonies like Jamaica and so they abolished slavery in their colonies. We were a slave society. We were really the largest slave society in modern history. There were a few places that abolished slavery after us, such as Brazil, but mostly Latin America and Mexico and so forth. They all abolished slavery long before we did. When we abolished slavery, though, it's important to realize we did do it violently and through a violent civil war in which the slaves themselves played a major role militarily. And that gave our abolition a strong democratic quality, and it changed the nature of our history, bringing it making it much more progressive and driving it toward the left.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that you talk about the Civil War as the first great crisis and kind of the rebirth of the nation. It reminds me of that old silent film, the classic Birth of a Nation, which brought which glamorized the KKK.
Right.
You talked a bit already about how the South, even though it was diverse, was dominated by slaveholders, and in the book you say that the slaveholders were convinced that patriarchal hierarchical dependence was the basis of freedom, which seems kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, I don't remember. Did I say that? Patriarchal hierarchical dependence was the basis of society, and that they believed in dependence. They believed that you couldn't just free the slaves; that they were like children; that they needed to grow up under the patronage of the slaveholders, and of course that was not going to happen right away. That was going to take generations and centuries and so forth. I'm not sure. I don't remember saying patriarchal dependence was the basis of freedom, but the slaveholders definitely believed in freedom for themselves. They believed that the model for freedom was ancient Greece, and Greece was a slave-holding society, and it was freedom for an elite.
Mm-hmm. Well, the hierarchy was maintained after the 14th Amendment by the Black Codes, the disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, those kinds of things.
Sharecropping, convict lease system, absolutely, yeah.
It was also surprising to me, I guess I knew this, but you mentioned that slavery was enshrined in core Western documents, Hebrew and Christian Bibles, the text of Plato and Aristotle, Catholic Church, the Koran. There were many places where slavery was enshrined in sacred documents. I didn't think about it like that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the important things in understanding the uniqueness of the American left and why it has played such a powerful role in our history, has actually changed our history, made us into a much better, more progressive country than we would have been without that, and why we need a left today. And that is to understand the power of the idea that is really the unique left idea, and that is the idea of equality. We bring that idea of equality. You will not find, for example, in the case of the first left, which is the Civil War, you will not find anywhere in the Founding Fathers, in Jefferson, in Washington, these are all great thinkers. Well, Washington's not a great thinker, but, Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and so forth. You will not find the idea of racial equality. It comes from the left. Mm-hmm. And it's not that the left invented the idea of racial equality. It bubbled up from slaves and from people who saw slavery and so forth. It was a moral revolution. So slavery was, as you say, it was basic to the Western traditions. It's in the Bible, it's in Christian writings, it's in Muslim writings, all the great philosophers and so forth. And then you get a revolution. You get the new idea of racial equality, and it's not something that you could predict. It's something in human nature itself. It takes a turn. And, of course, women's liberation has that form, gay liberation. No one would ever have predicted gay liberation. And so we need a left because of the power of this drive for deeper forms of equality than just equality before the law. The abolitionists didn't want to just abolish slavery and even just turn the ex-slaves into citizens. They wanted equality in the schools, in the churches. They wanted intermarriage. This is a distinct tradition of the American left.
There's some interesting movements there that I don't think everybody's aware of, even if they've had a good American history course regarding going to the same churches and the intermarriage thing that you mentioned. That wasn't, part of the popular presentation of how history progressed in the 19th century.
Right. I was actually very surprised when I was doing the research of how important, for example, racial intermarriage was, and the way in which the goal of intermarriage, support for intermarriage between the races was a precursor of gay marriage today.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of economic issues that led up to the Civil War, and the trends and the beliefs in what was supposed to happen, even with the plantations using scientific management and thinking of the chattel, the property that were slaves, as part of the process.
Right. So part of my idea is that the left comes to the fore, becomes important during periods of crisis. But a crisis is not just like an economic crisis as we've been through in the last few years, or a war. By a crisis, I mean a long-term transformation. And transformation of what? Transformation of the capitalist system. Capitalism is a little bit different from just saying the economic system. It was a whole way of life. So in the case of the first crisis, the Civil War, there was really a struggle between two fundamentally different social systems. One was based on small private ownerships, farms, shops, and people working for themselves, and the other was based on slave plantations, and that was by far the wealthier. Most of our early presidents came out of the slave system, but it was really, and Lincoln understood this perfectly well when he said, a house divided itself cannot stand. There were two different social systems.
Mm-hmm. Now, among those who emerged articulating points of view, David Bryan Davis is mentioned in early in your writing, and to him, the rise of large-scale industrial capitalism required moral justification, and
right.
Anti-slavery supplied that. But it wasn't just the abolition of slavery; it was
right.
about human suffering and injustice.
That's right. See, I think that David Bryan Davis, I think most people think he's a man in his late 80s now. I think most of us think that he's really one of our great historians, and I think most of our great historians actually are the people who have been studying slavery and abolition. And he makes the point, which is fundamental to my book, that you could abolish slavery. A lot of different people wanted to abolish slavery, but what would be the meaning of the abolition of slavery? You could abolish slavery and still have racial prejudice and believe that the slaves should be an underclass, so the ex-slaves. Why we needed a left is to bend the decision, the reform, the great change that was going to take place with the abolition of slavery, bend it in the direction of equality. It was the same thing in our second great crisis, the New Deal. Everybody could agree by the 1930s that we needed to reform capitalism. We needed to introduce even things like Social Security and so forth. But what would be the meaning? Government regulation of the banks, many things that we've now given up on that were, everyone saw as necessary at that point. But what would be the meaning? You could reform capitalism so it would be just a simple, more efficient capitalism that would benefit the 1% instead of the 99%. Or you could reform capitalism as we tried to do during the New Deal, so it would bring about greater equality, create a real middle-class society, really lift people into the into the middle class. And again, it was because there was a left. The left stood for the idea of, in that case, social equality. In the case of the Civil War, the left stood for racial equality, for example, in the schools, in the churches, in the marriage, and was trying to take a big change that the society was going through, a big reform that was ambiguous in its implications, and bend the ambiguity in the direction of equality. And that idea I got from David Bryan Davis.
The presidents of those two first crises, the Civil War and the Great Depression, they needed that moral compass. For example, Lincoln was for freeing the slaves, but it wasn't because of racial equality, which was a surprise to me.
Right. I mean, first of all, those two presidents are our two greatest presidents. These were the presidents of those crises. And they are not people of the left, but they are people who worked with a left. They worked with, Lincoln worked with the abolitionists. He did not agree with them. He was racially prejudiced. He believed that blacks and whites would not be able to live together. And similarly, the abolitionists understood this. Frederick Douglass, 20 years after Lincoln was assassinated, Frederick Douglass presided over the building of the unveiling of a statue to Lincoln, and he began his speech by saying, "Make no mistake about it, Abraham Lincoln was the white man's president, but he created the space in which we, the abolitionists, the free Negroes, could pursue our reforms and our agenda." So there's always a complicated relationship between a president and a left, and the really great moments in American history are moments when you have that interaction.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of religious influence on the thinking of the left, from the Calvinists and the Quakers in particular. I didn't the women's movement, the first feminist movement, got started in the late 19th century, the Elizabeth Cady Stantons and the Lucretia Motts and so forth. And that was an interesting influence. But I want to get back to presidents because, again, with FDR, who was an aristocrat, he began utilizing the masses in his 36 election by having the powerful and more wealthy forces rail against him, which was another surprise to me.
Right. Well, I think one reason that Franklin Roosevelt was such an effective president is he was an aristocrat. So, first of all, that meant he was used to the idea of taking care of people. He said the United States is a great estate. It has to be nurtured. It has to be cared for, and that meant things like conservation and so forth. So it's not. He did not believe that the United States was a business. It's an estate, like land that you have to care for, and also because he was a very wealthy aristocratic man himself and came from that kind of family, he was not intimidated by businessmen, and many of our presidents have been. They defer to the very wealthy, and they think the very wealthy know what they're doing. And you're absolutely right. In the 1936 election, he perceived that it would be much better he told the Democratic Party committee, don't write against the Republicans, write against the rich. We will have a much more successful election, and I think it was the greatest landslide in American history.
Mm-hmm. And we've got several things weaving their way between the Civil War and the Great Depression. I was surprised that Karl Marx covered the Civil War as a correspondent, for instance. But those movements, the labor movements that were emerging, became really important to the second crisis.
Right. See, there's a famous book called Why Is There No Socialism in America? And it contrasts the European lefts, and what the European lefts are socialist lefts tied to strong trade union movements. And as I say, the parliamentary systems in places like France and Germany are set up according to left, center, and right. We don't even get the term left until well into the 20th century after the Bolshevik Revolution. It's the European leftists bring it into the American context. But we in the United States, we have an unbelievably terrific left tradition, in many ways greater than the European traditions. But it's different. You won't find, it's not continuous. You don't have a continuous Labor Party or Social Democratic Party as you find in Europe. Our left springs up periodically. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is establish that it constitutes a tradition and a unity, and to try to show what's in it and what's not in it. But it's one of the most active left. And the thing that I think really distinguishes the American left is it's grounded in freedom. It's not opposing equality against freedom. It's equality on the basis of freedom.
Mm-hmm. And there were several times when the labor movement got pretty well organized, and I starting with the Knights of Labor, and I think it's around depressions mostly, isn't it? That
actually, labor movements do better. They really fall apart during depressions. Mm-hmm. They really do better during periods of prosperity. One of the things that made the AFL, which was the craft workers, work well is when Samuel Gompers saw that you had to charge a lot of dues and build up a fund and so forth so that the trade unions could survive during depressions. But we've had unbelievably militant trade union movement, anarchist movement, the IWW, syndicalists, Socialist Party under Debs published a newspaper called The Appeal to Reason, which was sort of like People magazine today. It was everybody read it. We had socialist congressmen, socialist mayors. Mm-hmm. So we have a very, very rich tradition in America.
Yeah, and Debs at one point garnered almost 6% of the vote, and
that's right.
Even from prison, he
that's right.
won the vote in 3%.
That's right.
That paper you mentioned, The Appeal to Reason, at one point had a circulation of 750,000 people.
That's right.
That's a pretty amazing statistic.
Yes.
FDR is influenced in part by the time when he was Secretary of the Navy, recognizing what planning could achieve. And you address planning and what that means in the popular front a little bit. Planning could be determined by business or by popular forces, and that's kind of an interesting influence on this whole flow.
Yes, that's very important. World War I, not just for the United States, but throughout the West, that was the great moment. Of course, that was the moment when you had the Bolshevik Revolution, too, which was they had the 5-year plans and so forth. But World War I was the moment when people saw what government could do with the economy. For example, in the United States, when we entered the war, there was a huge snowstorm in the South, and they needed the cotton to make the uniforms and so forth, and the trains were all stalled. And the Secretary of Treasury simply seized the railroads and cleared had the roads cleared and just did it. You could do things with a command economy, with using the executive branch of government that you couldn't do if you just left them to the market or to private initiative if they were not profitable. For example, during the New Deal, the United States government went out and brought electricity to all of rural America. Electric companies didn't want to do it because it was too expensive. So this idea of planning came in very powerfully. But once again, it was ambiguous. It's the same point as David Bryan Davis. You could plan for the rich or you could plan for the many. You could plan for the 1% or you could plan for the 99%. And one of the key points of the second American left, which is the left of the time of the New Deal, was the need to have an organized working class in the trade union movement, represented in government, shaping the project of planning.
Mm-hmm. Now, we only have about 5 minutes left, and we haven't really touched on the new left, and I want to get to your American left today, too. But those years between World War II and the 60s were the high point of American hegemony, you say. At the end of the war, they had two-thirds of the world's gold reserves, produced half the world's manufacturing output, half its ships, the largest exporter. I don't know what happened to us since then, but between World War II and the 60s, it was an amazing time for us.
Yeah. Right.
And the new left emerged somewhere in there because of the Cold War.
The third left, the first left is the abolitionists. The second left are the socialists, and the new left is the third left, and that's sort of the left we're still with. Mm-hmm. And that's the left that created women's liberation, created gay liberation, created the kind of sensitivity we have to the situation of disabled peoples today, the whole range of new rights and so forth. But I'm trying to suggest in my book that we have to look at the left of our time, starting with the 60s and starting with the new left. We have to see that more in the context of another long-term change in American society, and one that requires a left, not the new left or the current left, but a left that can intervene and help change our society in terms of that we need to make a fundamental decision about the direction of our society. Because what did happen to the fact that the United States between the World War II and let's say the 1960s or the 1970s had so much wealth. If you were growing up in that period, you felt you could do anything. We created Medicare, but we created the great university systems and so forth. We gave the world so much in terms of science and in terms of literature and the like. And what has happened since then? We have not really used that wealth to develop a genuinely middle class, a genuinely egalitarian society, and we have not really pushed our global power in the direction of understanding the longings of the people of the world. We've defined the world as a dangerous place. It is not a dangerous place. It is mostly, of course, there are dangers, but mostly concerned with people like us who want a decent life and so forth. Instead, we've let the natural workings of the market, but the market by itself will invariably concentrate wealth. It does not disperse wealth. It does both, but I mean the main thing is the concentration. And we've seen the consequences of that in terms of creating a two-tier society, creating separate educational systems, separate housings, separate opportunity structures, and so forth. And everyone now recognizes it's very dramatic. That has to change. It's not going to work economically. It doesn't work politically. It's not moral. Yes. That's got to change, and I'm arguing that a left has a crucial role to play in bringing about that change. Not just in bringing it about, but in moving it in the direction of equality.
That's a good summary that points to why this book is so very timely now. You talk about the abolition was given the meaning of racial equality by the left, and that the welfare state was given the social equality, and we're dismantling that now. And all of these forces, from feminists to ecology activists to gay liberationists to pacifists to Occupy Wall Street, are looking to redefine once again what needs to happen. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this is a very interesting read, Why America Needs a Left. We've been talking with Eli Zaretsky. I remind our listeners that if you don't hear our show the 4 times it's broadcast each week, we're also available on Facebook at Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.